Ruth Mercer found the condemnation notice nailed to her own front door, the same door her husband built. 3 weeks after the army returned his folded flag, she did not take it down. She read it twice. The land agent came a week later. He stood on her porch in front of 2 neighbors and the mail carrier, and he did not lower his voice. $18 an acre is generous for dirt, Mrs. Mercer. There's a war on. Sign, or the marshal sets your furniture in the road. 4 people heard him say it. 4 people watched her nod. So the widow did the one thing no one expected of a farm woman in mourning. She wrote away for a single sheet of paper the army had stamped confidential. And she asked for 12 strangers in a jury box. If you believe quiet people read the fine print, this story is for you. Before we go on, do one small thing for me. Subscribe so the algorithm carries stories like Ruth's a little farther. And leave a comment telling me the town you're watching from. I want to see how far Ruth's story travels, from her porch in Kansas to yours. Now let me take you back to the beginning, before the tack was ever driven into that doorframe. Ladana, Kansas, the spring of 1943. You have to understand the ground first, because this whole story is really about the ground. 150 acres of bottomland outside Ladana in Halverson County. Good ground. The kind a man could work his whole life for and never quite believe he owned. It lay in the low crook of Sanders Creek, flat and black and patient. When the spring rains came hard, the water rolled off the higher farms and pooled everywhere it could. But not on the Mercer place. Not anymore. Because Daniel Mercer had spent 9 years teaching that water where to go. He'd laid tile drainage under those fields by hand. Clay pipe, foot by foot, in trenches he dug himself with a mule and a scoop and a back that never quit. He'd graded a lane from the county road all the way to the barn, so a truck could roll in loaded even in a wet March. He'd sunk a deep well, a real well 40 feet down to a vein of water that ran cold and steady through the worst August the county could throw at it. While the neighbors hauled water in dry years, the Mercer stock drank their fill. Daniel did all of it. And Daniel was dead. He'd enlisted the week after Pearl Harbor. Ruth remembered the kitchen that morning, the radio still warm. His coffee going cold on the formica while he stared out the window at his own fields. He didn't say much. Daniel never did. He just set the cup down and said, "Somebody has to." And that was that. They killed him in the Pacific in the fall of 1942. Ruth was 37 years old, and she was alone on 150 acres. And she kept it alive by herself because she did not know how to do anything else. His last letters were folded into the family Bible. She kept them there because that felt like the right place for words she couldn't read without her throat closing. Some evenings she took them out. Most evenings she didn't. But there was one thing she took down almost every night, and it wasn't a letter. It was his ledger. A field ledger, plain green cloth over cardboard, the corners soft from his hands. Daniel had written down everything. Every foot of tile he laid, with the date and the depth. Every dollar of lime he spread. Every load of manure. Every fence post set. Every hour behind the mule. He wasn't a bookish man. But he loved that land the way some men love a religion, and the ledger was his catechism. Ruth read it by lamplight because reading his handwriting was the closest thing she had left to hearing his voice. That's all it was, at first. Grief, not strategy. A widow running her thumb over the loops of a dead man's letters under the yellow light of a kerosene lamp. Listening to a house that was too quiet now. Every foot of tile, every dollar of lime, in his own hand. She did not know, those spring nights, that she was reading the most important document in the state of Kansas. She just knew it smelled like him. Pencil lead and machine oil and the barn. The notice came on a Tuesday. She'd been out since before light, and she came up the graded lane at mid-morning with mud to her boot tops and a lame heifer on her mind. She saw the white paper from 100 feet off. It was nailed to the front door. Not folded and left in the mailbox. Not handed to her. Nailed, a government tack driven straight through the paper and into the doorframe Daniel had planed smooth with his own 2 hands. She stood in front of it a while before she read it. Notice of condemnation. War Department. District Land Office. The United States of America, in the exercise of its power of eminent domain and by reason of military necessity, hereby gives notice of its intention to acquire the following described real property. And then the legal description of her farm. Her farm turned into a paragraph of surveyor's numbers. There was an enclosure, a single folded sheet. The offer, $18 an acre, $2,700 for the whole place. And below the number, in the flat gray language of a clerk who had never set foot on the ground he was pricing, 4 words that would sit in Ruth Mercer's chest for the rest of her life. Assessed as unimproved pasture. Unimproved. She read it twice, standing at the door with the mud drying on her boots. Then she went inside and sat down at the kitchen table. And she put both hands flat on the wood, and she was very still for a long time. Unimproved pasture. As if the tile weren't down there in the dark doing its quiet work, as if the well were dry, as if the lane were a cowpath, as if Daniel had spent 9 years of his one short life on nothing at all. She did not cry. That surprised her later when she thought about it. She had cried plenty over Daniel, buckets, oceans, in the barn where no one could hear. But that word didn't make her cry. It made her cold and clear, the way the well water was cold and clear. It made her think. Now, here is where most people would have signed. Understand what she was. A woman alone, in mourning, in wartime. Being told by the United States government that her land was worth $18 an acre. Being told there was a war on, and that patriotic people didn't argue. The whole weight of the thing was built to make you sign. That's how it works. You feel small, and the paper feels large, and you sign. Ruth did not sign. But she didn't fight, either. Not yet. She did the reasonable thing. The thing a fair person does when they assume they're dealing with fair people. She sat down that same night, and she wrote a letter back. A plain letter. No lawyer's words, because she didn't have a lawyer and wouldn't have known one to call. She just wrote what was true. That the land was not unimproved pasture. That it was drained with tile her husband laid by hand. That it had a deep well that held through drought. That it had a graded all-weather lane. That the fields were limed and worked and producing wheat and pasturing dairy stock, and that she would be glad to walk any man from the land office over every acre and show him. She wrote it out twice to get it clean. She mailed it the next morning from the post office in Ladana. And she paid the 3 cents, and she felt, walking home, something almost like relief. She had told the truth. Surely the truth was enough. Surely someone would come and look. That was Ruth's blind spot, and it's worth naming because it's a good person's blind spot. She believed that truth on paper was self-evidently enough. She believed that if you wrote down what was real and mailed it to the right office, a reasonable man would read it and do the right thing. She did not yet understand how good the machine is at not reading. How a true letter can go into a file and never come out. How you can be completely, provably right and still lose, because being right and being heard are 2 different animals. No one came. No one wrote back. The letter went into a drawer in the district land office and it stayed there. And 3 weeks after she mailed it, Harlan Voss drove out to her farm to collect a signature. You could hear his car coming up the county road before you could see it. A government Ford, dark and clean, out of place among the mud, splashed trucks of Halverson County. It was a Saturday. There were people around, which was not an accident. Ruth would come to understand that Voss did nothing by accident. 2 of her neighbors were there, the Kessler brothers from the next section over, come to borrow her hay rake. And Ed Toohey, the rural mail carrier, was just pulling up to her box at the end of the lane. So when Harlan Voss got out of his car and buttoned his suit coat and walked up toward the house, there were witnesses. Voss knew there were witnesses. That was the point. A man like that liked an audience for the same reason a bully likes a schoolyard. Ruth came off the porch to meet him, wiping her hands on her apron. She'd been rendering lard. She remembered that. The whole yard smelled of it. Voss was not an ugly man. That's a thing people get wrong about villains. He was trim and pressed and pleasant-looking, maybe 50, with a salt and pepper trim to his hair and a small mustache and a way of smiling that never once reached his eyes. He carried a leather folder under his arm. He looked out over her fields the way a man looks at a used car he's already decided to lowball. "Mrs. Mercer," he said. "Harlan Voss, District Land Office. I believe we've been corresponding." "I wrote you a letter," Ruth said. 3 weeks back. I asked if someone would come look at the ground. "I'm here," Voss said and smiled. But he didn't look at the ground. That was the thing she noticed. That was the thing all 4 witnesses noticed and would remember and would talk about for years after. Ruth offered to walk him out to the fields. She offered to show him the tile lines, the well, the drainage. She said the words she'd rehearsed, about the improvements, about what Daniel built. And Harlan Voss put his hands in his trouser pockets, and he did not take them out. He walked with her a little way into the near field, out of politeness or theater. But he walked with his hands buried in his pockets and his eyes on the middle distance, and he never once bent down. Never once looked at a tile mouth. Never once asked to see the well. A man does not put his hands in his pockets when he means to inspect something. He puts his hands in his pockets when he has already made up his mind and only wants the walk to be over. Ruth kept talking. She told him about the depth of the well. She told him the fields didn't flood when the Sanders bottom flooded. And Voss stopped, in the middle of her field, in front of the Kessler brothers who drifted close enough to hear, and Ed Toohey standing by his mail truck with a bundle of letters forgotten in his hand. And Harlan Voss delivered the line. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, easy and loud, "there's a war on. $18 an acre is generous for dirt. The government isn't in the business of paying a premium because a woman is fond of her cow pasture." He let that sit a beat, so everyone could taste it. "Sign the papers, and there's a check waiting. Don't, and it goes harder, and it costs you more, and you get the same result. I've seen 100 of these. They always end the same way. Generous for dirt." 4 people heard it. Ruth did not raise her voice. That was never her way. But she reached into her apron, into the deep front pocket, and she took out a thing she'd made ready that morning because some part of her had known how this would go. It was a copy of Daniel's ledger. She'd sat up 2 nights copying it out in her own careful hand. Every entry, every foot of tile, every dollar of lime, every improvement with its date, so that if a man from the government would only read it, he would have to know. She held it out to him across the black dirt of her own field. "This is what my husband built," she said. "It's all written down, what it cost, what it's worth. I'm asking you to read it. That's all. Just read it." Harlan Voss looked at the little sheaf of papers in her hand. And this is the part the witnesses never forgot, the part that would sit in a courtroom like a stone 2 seasons later. He took it. And he did not open it. He took it from her, and he folded it once without looking at it, and he slid it into the leather folder under his arm, in among his own papers, the way you'd pocket a napkin you meant to throw away later. And he smiled at her. "I'll be sure to give it every consideration," he said. He didn't mean to give it any. Everyone standing there knew it. He'd taken it the way you take a child's drawing, to end the conversation, not to look at it. He turned and walked back toward his clean dark car with his hands going into his pockets again. And he left Ruth Mercer standing in her own field holding nothing, with the smell of rendered lard in the air and 4 neighbors who didn't know where to look. Remember that ledger, in his folder, unopened, it's going to matter more than anything else in this story. But he doesn't know that yet. He thinks he just pocketed a grieving woman's scrapbook. He has no idea what's written in it, because he will not lower himself to read it. That's not just rudeness. That's the whole hinge of the thing. Keep it in your mind. Now, when the letter didn't work, and the visit didn't work, the government did what the government does. It made things official. It gave her a hearing. And I want you to hear the word hearing, and I want you to notice, by the end, whether anyone actually heard. The County Condemnation Commission met in the Halverson County Courthouse on the last Thursday in April. 3 commissioners, appointed men, local men, sitting at a long table on a low platform at the front of the room. It was their job, on paper, to determine just compensation, to look at the government's offer and the landowner's claim and decide what was fair. The room filled up. That surprised Ruth. She'd expected to sit alone. But word travels in a farm county, and a lot of those farmers understood something Ruth hadn't fully let herself think yet. That if the government could take the Mercer place for $18 an acre and call it pasture, it could take any of theirs the same way. So they came. In clean shirts, hats in their hands, filling the wooden benches. The Kesslers, old Toohey, 24 more. Rural people don't say much, but they show up. That's their language. Harlan Voss ran the room like a man who'd run 100 of these. Because he had. He stood and presented the government's case, and it took him about 20 minutes, and it was very smooth. He talked about military necessity and the airfield the Army Corps of Engineers needed to build, and the sacrifices being asked of everyone in wartime. And then he got to value. And here is where you have to pay close attention, because here is where the whole crooked machinery is right out in the open, if only somebody had known to name it. Voss presented comparable sales. That's how you set a price on land. You show what similar land nearby recently sold for. It sounds fair. It sounds like arithmetic, and it's the easiest thing in the world to rig if nobody checks your work. He presented 3 sales. 3 parcels that had changed hands in Halverson County in the last 2 years, and every one of them sold cheap, around $18 or $19 an acre, which was exactly the number Voss needed. But those 3 parcels. Ruth's neighbors shifted on the benches when he named them, because they knew that ground. One was up on the Renner Flats, thin dry upland that grew more sandbur than wheat, no water on it at all. One was the old Petrie place, half of it in a gully that washed worse every year. And one flooded every single spring, so bad you couldn't put a plow on it before June. 3 of the sorriest parcels in the county, worn out, dry, or drowned. And Voss laid them down like they were the same as 150 acres of tiled, watered, graded bottomland. He knew they weren't. That was the trick. You pick your comparables to get the answer you already want, and you say the words comparable sales in a confident voice. And if the men at the table don't know the ground, they nod. The 3 commissioners nodded. They were not evil men, I don't think. That's almost worse. They were tired men in a hurry who'd been told there was a war on and the army needed the land, and here was a government agent with papers all in order, and their job was to move it along. They did not know Ruth's fields from the Renner Flats. They took Voss's word. It was easier. And Voss had built his whole presentation to make taking his word the easy thing. Then they let Ruth speak. Once, she stood up in her good dark dress, the one she'd worn to the memorial service, and the room went quiet. She didn't have a lawyer. She didn't have comparable sales of her own. She had the truth and a voice that shook a little at the start and then steadied. She said the 3 parcels were nothing like her place. She said hers was drained and watered and worked. She started to explain about the well, about how it held in a dry year. And the chairman of the commission lifted his gavel, not unkindly, and said, "Mrs. Mercer, the commission has the government's appraisal. We understand you're attached to the property. Please keep your remarks brief." Brief, she had 1 minute to answer 20 of Voss's, and they were already reaching for the gavel. So she said the truest thing she had, the thing she'd carried into that room, and she said it slow so it would land, and it's on the record to this day. "You are pricing my well," she said, "as if there is no water in it. I have offered 3 times to show you the water." Mr. Voss would not look. This commission has not looked. I am not asking you to give me anything. I am asking you to look before you decide what a thing is worth. That's all. I am asking you to look. For a moment the room was completely silent. That silence is the heart of this whole story, so sit in it with me a second. A room full of farmers who knew exactly how right she was, and 3 commissioners who'd already decided, and Harlan Voss with his hands folded, patient, certain. Nobody moved. You could hear the big clock on the courthouse wall. And then the chairman set down his gavel and cleared his throat and said the commission found the government's offer of $2,700 to be just compensation, and thanked everyone for their time. That was it. That was the hearing. It took them about a minute and a half to price a dead man's life's work at $18 an acre in front of a room of people who knew better and couldn't do a thing. Ruth walked out into the April sun. The Kessler brothers wouldn't meet her eye. They were so ashamed on her behalf. Somebody's wife squeezed her arm. Nobody knew what to say. Because what everybody in that square understood, walking to their trucks, was that being right hadn't mattered even a little. The truth had stood up in that room and spoken plain, and the machine had gavelled it down and moved on to the next thing on its list. If the story ended there, you'd have heard it 1,000 times. Little person, big government, little person loses. That's the version they count on. That's the version that makes you sign. But I told you at the start she read the fine print. And here comes the part where it starts to matter. Because the commission's finding wasn't the end of the government's power. It was the government reaching for more of it. A commission finding is slow, and slow doesn't win a war. The army wanted that ground now, not after appeals. So Voss's office reached for the heaviest tool in the whole box. They filed a declaration of taking. It came in June, and it was a different kind of paper than the notice. The notice had been an intention. This was an act. A declaration of taking meant the United States took title to Ruth's farm the instant it was filed. Not after a hearing. Not after she agreed. That instant. In exchange, the government deposited its number, the $2,700, into the registry of the federal court, and by law that deposit was supposed to make the taking complete and lawful. And with the deposit made, they had the right to immediate possession. She had 21 days to vacate. 21 days to be off the land Daniel built, or the marshal would put her off it. A federal marshal drove out and staked the field. Ruth watched him from the porch. A man she'd never met, walking her bottomland with a bundle of surveyor's stakes and a hammer, driving them into ground Daniel had drained, marking the corners of a thing that was no longer hers. She stood on the porch her husband built and watched a stranger nail her farm shut. And something in her that had been grief for 8 months turned, quietly, into something harder. You feel the tone of this story change right here. Up until now she'd been reasonable. Writing letters. Offering to show the well. Believing. Now the believing was gone, burned clean off, and what was left underneath was resolve, and resolve is a colder and more dangerous thing than anger. She loaded the truck over the next weeks. There wasn't much she wanted. She sold the dairy stock because she'd have no place to put them. She packed the kitchen, the beds, the few good things. She worked steady and dry-eyed through all of it. But there were 2 things she did not pack until the very last. She left them on the wall to the end, and she took them down last, together, the morning she drove out for good. The first was the folded flag, the one the army gave her in the little triangle case, 3 weeks before the notice was ever nailed up. Daniel, folded into a triangle of stars. And the second was the ledger. His green cloth ledger, soft at the corners. She wrapped them both in a clean feed sack and set them on the truck seat beside her, not in the back with the furniture. On the seat. where she could put her hand on them. She would not leave that ledger behind for anything on earth. She didn't fully know why that morning. She just knew those two things were Daniel, and everything else was only property, and the government could have the property. It had taken it already. She drove out the graded lane he cut by hand, past the marshal's stakes, and she did not look in the mirror. Now she had nowhere much to go. She took a rented room in Ladonna over the hardware store, and she moved Daniel's flag and Daniel's ledger onto the little mantel there, and she sat in a strange room in the town she'd shopped in her whole life, dispossessed, with $2,700 sitting in a court registry she'd never seen for a farm worth God knew what. And most people, right there, are done. There's no undoing a declaration of taking. The land is gone, legally, finally gone. Even a lawyer would tell her to take the check and start over. Which is exactly what a lawyer told her. But listen to the whole of what he said, because it changes everything. His name was Gideon Marsh. He kept an office off the Ladonna Square, up a flight of stairs, one room with a roll-top desk and a lot of dust. He'd lost a leg in the Great War, at Belleau Wood, and he wore the empty trouser leg pinned up and got around on a crutch and a cane and a great deal of stubbornness. He'd been a good lawyer once. He was rusty now and half broke, and he mostly did wills and deeds for people who paid him in eggs. Ruth went to him because he was the only lawyer in town who'd fought in a war himself, and she thought maybe a man who'd bled for the country would understand what it meant to be robbed by it. She sat across the roll-top desk and told him the whole of it. The nailed notice, the letter no one answered, Voss with his hands in his pockets, generous for dirt, the 3 sorry parcels dressed up as comparables, the gavel, the stakes in the field. Gideon Marsh listened to all of it without a word, tapping a pencil slow against the desk. And when she finished, he told her the hard truth first, because a good lawyer always does. "The land is gone, Mrs. Mercer," he said. "I want you to hear that plain, so I don't sell you a dream. They filed the declaration of taking. That's done. I could file every motion in the book and I could not put you back on that ground. The airfield is coming. The army will build it. That fight is over before it started, and anybody who tells you different is after your money." Ruth's face didn't change. "I know that," she said. "I've known it since the marshal staked the field. I'm not trying to keep the land." She leaned forward. "I'm trying to be paid what it's worth. They're taking it. All right. Let them take it. But let them pay for what they take. Not $18 for dirt. What it's worth. What Daniel put into it." And Gideon Marsh set down his pencil and looked at her a good while, and something old and long asleep woke up behind his eyes. "Now that," he said slowly, "is a different question entirely. And it's the one they're counting on you not to ask. Here is the thing he taught her, in that dusty room. And here is the thing I want you to carry out of this video even if you forget everything else about Ruth Mercer. The government can take your land. That power is real, it's in the Constitution, it's called eminent domain, and you cannot stop it. But that same Constitution, the Fifth Amendment, the very last clause of it, says they cannot take it without just compensation. Just compensation. Not the compensation they offer, not the number their own agent writes down. Just compensation. What it is actually truly worth. And who decides what's just? That was the door Voss had spent all his energy keeping shut. Because a commission of tired local men, Gideon explained, is easy. You show them your comparables, and they nod. But the Constitution guarantees something a land agent dreads. If the landowner demands it, the question of just compensation goes to a jury. 12 citizens. 12 ordinary people who can be walked out to a field and shown a well and asked to use their own eyes and their own sense of what's fair. That deposit they made, Gideon said, and now he was leaning forward too, the pencil forgotten. The 2,700. In their heads, that's the price. In the law, it's nothing but their opening bid. It's the number they hope you'll take because you're tired and you're grieving and you're scared. But if you don't take it, if you leave it sitting right there in that registry untouched, and you demand a jury, then 12 of your neighbors get to say what your husband's work was worth. Not Harlan Voss. Not 3 men with a gavel. 12 people who know what tiled bottomland is worth in this county, because they farm it. Ruth sat very still. "A jury," she said. "For the price." "For the price," Gideon said. "The Fifth Amendment gives it to you. They will do everything short of the illegal to keep you from using it, because they win those hearings and they lose those trials. But it's yours. You only have to reach up and take it. And you can see it, can't you? The whole thing turning over in that dusty second-floor room. The grieving woman who wrote a polite letter and got gavelled down, being handed the one tool built exactly for a moment like this. Not a way to keep the farm, a way to make them pay for it. Honestly, in the open. In front of witnesses. The way it should have been from the start. She went home to her rented room that night, and she took the ledger down off the mantel, and she read it by lamplight, the way she had 100 nights out of grief. But it was different now, and she felt it. She wasn't reading it to hear his voice anymore. She was reading it as evidence. Every foot of tile with its date. Every dollar of lime. Daniel had appraised his own land, entry by entry, over 9 years, never knowing why it would matter. He'd left her a complete, itemized, handwritten record of exactly what the government's agent refused to look at. Truth on paper. She'd believed all along that truth on paper was enough. She'd been wrong about that. The letter proved it. The hearing proved it. Truth on paper isn't enough by itself. But truth on paper, put in front of 12 honest people who are made to read it, that might be enough. That might be more than enough. She made her decision on a Sunday, and she acted on the Monday, and this is the moment the whole story turns. She walked into the federal courthouse. The same building, the same square where they'd gavelled her down. And with Gideon Marsh at her side, working his crutch up the stone steps one at a time, Ruth Mercer filed a formal demand. A demand for a trial by jury on the question of just compensation. And in the same stroke, she did the thing that made it real, the thing that told everyone she meant it all the way to the end. She refused to withdraw the $2,700. She could have taken it. Most do. The law would have let her draw that deposit out of the registry and use it to live on while she fought for more. But Gideon told her, and she understood in her bones, that untouched money is untainted money. If she never laid a finger on their number, then she had accepted nothing, conceded nothing, agreed to nothing. Every dollar of their offer would sit right there in the court's registry, whole, while she stood up in front of 12 citizens and said, "That is not what my husband's land is worth, and I will let you decide what is." She was 37 years old, a widow, living over a hardware store, with no farm and no husband, and a rented room and a folded flag on the mantel. And she had just told the United States government that she would see it in front of a jury. She was not fighting the Airfield. Let that be clear, because it's the elegant heart of what she did. She never once tried to stop the runway. The country needed it, and Daniel had died for that country, and she would not stand in its way. What she was doing was cleaner and harder to answer than that. She was billing the government for the truth. And she was going to make 12 of her neighbors read the invoice, written in her dead husband's own hand. Across town, in the district land office, a clerk brought Harlan Voss the filing. A demand for jury trial on just compensation in the matter of the Mercer parcel. And the clerk, who was nervous, mentioned that the widow had gotten herself a lawyer. That Gideon Marsh had signed the papers, and Harlan Voss looked up from his desk, and he smiled that smile that never reached his eyes, and somewhere in his leather folder, still folded, still unopened, sat a copy of a green cloth ledger he had never once bothered to read. He had no idea what was coming, but you're starting to. The first thing Gideon Marsh did was clear his kitchen table. He lived above his office, and the office was 2 rooms, and the second room was full of boxes he'd never unpacked from a life that had more furniture in it. He swept the table clean with his forearm. newspapers, a cold pipe, a plate, all of it onto the floor. Then he set down the green cloth ledger, and he set down a pad of yellow paper, and he told Ruth to make coffee, because they were going to be a while. She made the coffee. She'd learned to make it in a machine shop apron once, in another life, and she made it strong. Here is what a lawsuit over the price of land actually looks like. It is not a shout. It is not a speech. It is two people at a table with a pencil, building a wall one brick at a time, and every brick is a fact you can prove. Marsh started with the comparables. Voss had used 3 sales. 3 worn-out parcels, miles off, dry land pasture that never held water in a wet spring. He'd priced Ruth's ground against dirt that couldn't grow what her dirt grew. So Marsh went and found the other sales. The real ones. Bottomland like hers, drained and watered, that had changed hands in the last 2 years. He wrote to the county register. He wrote to a title man he'd gone to school with. He pulled the deeds himself, 1 leg and a cane and a courthouse basement, and he came back up the stairs with numbers. Drained bottomland with a live well. $60 an acre. 80, 90, one of them, the spring before. Not 18. Nobody was selling ground like hers for $18 an acre, and everybody in Halverson County knew it. Then he opened the ledger. He read it the way Voss never had. Slow, line by line. And what he found in Daniel Mercer's small square hand was a man's entire 9 years of work priced out to the dollar. Every foot of drain tile, when it went in and what it cost. The lime, by the ton, by the year. The well, 40 feet down to good water, dug by hand and by neighbor and by rented rig, every dollar of it entered on the page. The graded lane, the fences, the dairy barn floor. Marsh sat back. He was quiet a long moment. Your husband, he said, appraised his own land. He just didn't know that's what he was doing. He was keeping accounts, Ruth said. He hated to owe anybody. Well, Marsh said, and he tapped the page. The government owes you now. And here's the bill. In his hand, dated, itemized, a jury is going to read a dead soldier's own numbers. Ruth, do you understand what that is? She understood. She'd understood since the first night by the lamp. She just hadn't had a name for it. Across town, Harlan Voss was not worried. His clerk brought him the filing. And then the clerk brought him a second piece of news, the kind clerks bring nervously, holding their breath. The widow had retained counsel. Gideon Marsh had signed the demand. Voss laughed. He actually laughed, out loud at his desk. Marsh, he said. The one with the leg. Yes, sir. A widow and a cripple. He shook his head, still smiling that smile that stopped at his cheekbones. She'll spend money she doesn't have, and a jury of farmers will look at a government offer and a grieving woman, and they'll feel bad, and they'll bump it $50, and everyone will go home. File it under settled and don't bother me with it again. And in his leather folder, in a drawer, folded once and never opened, sat a copy of a green cloth ledger. He didn't take it out. He didn't read it now, either. He had a war to close parcels for, and he closed them cheap, and his savings record was the best in the district. He was proud of that number. He liked to think of it as his own kind of ledger. He had read the wrong one his whole career. He was about to find that out in front of a jury. Now here is where the story turns, and it turns on a young man's conscience. His name was Lieutenant Prentice Cahill, Army Corps of Engineers, and he was the one who had surveyed the ground. He was young enough to still believe that doing a thing right and doing a thing were the same thing. He'd walked Ruth's acres with a transit and a notebook, and he'd written down what he found, and what he found had bothered him ever since. Marsh went to see him, not to trap him, just to ask. They sat in the front room of the boarding house where the Corps had billeted its officers, and Cahill turned his cap in his hands, and after a while he said something he probably shouldn't have. You want to know why they took her place and not the Kesslers, he said, or any of the 4 farms that touch it. I do. Because hers is the only one that holds. Cahill looked at the window. Everything around it floods. Come a wet April, that whole bottom is soup. All of it, every parcel, except hers. Mercer had it drained, tiled, graded, a lane that sheds water. It's the one firm approach to the runway on that whole stretch of the river. We didn't pick it because it was cheap, we picked it because it was the only ground that would carry a bomber without sinking. The room was very quiet. "Is that in a report?" Marsh asked. Cahill didn't answer right away. And that silence was the answer. "It's a survey report," he said finally. "It went up the chain. It's marked confidential." Now think about what Gideon Marsh was holding all of a sudden in that boarding house parlor. The government had condemned Ruth's land as unimproved pasture, worthless dirt, $18 an acre. And somewhere in an Army file, marked confidential, was a report written by the government's own engineers that said the exact opposite. That said her ground alone was firm, her drainage, her husband's 9 years of work, essential, the single piece of earth for miles that could hold what the war needed to put on it. You cannot call a thing worthless and essential at the same time. Not on paper, not under oath. The truth doesn't bend that way. Marsh went home and did not sleep. He drew up a subpoena. He demanded the Corps of Engineers produce the survey report for the Mercer parcel in full at trial. And Harlan Voss, when he heard, stopped laughing. He moved to quash it. That's the lawyer's word for it. He filed a motion to keep that report sealed, out of the courtroom, out of the jury's hands. He called it confidential. He called it wartime security. He called it irrelevant to the price of pasture. The hearing on that motion took 20 minutes. The judge was an old man with reading glasses down his nose, and he listened to Voss's man argue security. And then he looked over the top of the glasses at Gideon Marsh. "Mr. Marsh, Your Honor, the government has valued this land as ordinary. Their own engineers surveyed it. If that survey says ordinary, it helps them, and they should be glad to show it. If it says something else, Marsh, let it sit." Then the jury is entitled to know what the government knew when it wrote its check for $18 an acre. The judge took his glasses off. "Produce the report," he said. "The relevant portions." Motion to quash is denied. 1 minute. It took the old man 1 minute to say it. And here is the second thing this story teaches you, free of charge, the same way Gideon Marsh taught it to Ruth over cold coffee. When the government stands up and says we must have this land, that this land is necessary, that only this land will do, it has just told you the land is valuable. Necessity is not the opposite of worth. Necessity is proof of worth. You cannot need a thing that badly and pay for it like it's nothing. The moment they declared they had to have her 40 best acres, they wrote the top line of her invoice for her. Voss knew it too. That's why he'd tried to bury the report. The morning of the trial, LaDonna filled up. Ruth didn't ask them to come. She would never in her life have asked. But the neighbor farmers came anyway, in their trucks, and the trucks lined both sides of Main Street clear past the 5 and dime, mud on the fenders, dogs in the beds. The Kessler brothers came. Ed Toohey, the mail carrier, came in his good shirt. Men who had watched Harlan Voss stand on Ruth's porch with his hands in his pockets and call her land dirt. And who had said nothing then because there was nothing to say. They came now. The courthouse room was the same room. That was the thing. It was the same room where the county commission had gavelled her down 8 months before. Same high windows, same long benches, same smell of floor wax and old paper. The room that had told her to sit down and be quiet was about to hear 12 of her neighbors tell the United States government what her husband's land was worth. Voss went first, because the government always goes first. He was smooth. Give him that. He put his valuation man up, and the man talked about comparable sales, and he showed the 3 dry parcels again, the worn-out pasture. And he said the Mercer place was ordinary bottom ground, no different from its neighbors, and that $18 an acre was fair, generous even, given the war. Then Voss himself took the stand. And when Marsh, on cross, walked toward the ledger, Daniel's ledger, sitting there on the evidence table in its green cloth, Voss got out ahead of it. "Your Honor," he said, "I'd move to exclude that book entirely. It's a dead man's guesswork. A farmer's private scribbling. There's no appraiser's signature on it, no professional standard. It's grief written down. It isn't evidence. A dead man's guesswork." Ruth heard him say it, in that same room, in front of those same people, and she did not move. Her hands stayed folded in her lap, but something went cold and still and certain in her, the way it had the night she read the notice twice and did not take it down. The judge said he'd hear argument on the ledger later. For a moment, one long, ugly moment, it looked like the machine might win after all. The report struck through. The ledger barred. The widow's dead husband called a scribbler in open court. That was the valley. That was the moment the whole room held its breath. Then Gideon Marsh stood up, on his one leg and his cane, and called Lieutenant Prentice Cahill to the stand. You could feel the room turn. Nobody knew who he was. A young officer in a clean uniform walking up the aisle, and Voss at his table going very slightly gray around the mouth, because Voss knew exactly who he was. Marsh kept it plain. He didn't perform. He just asked. "Lieutenant, you surveyed the ground the Army took from Mrs. Mercer." "I did, sir." "Why that ground?" "There are 4 farms that touch it." "Why hers?" Cahill looked at the jury, 12 farmers. He was talking to men who knew soil. "Because everything around it floods," he said. "Come a wet spring, that whole river bottom goes to mud, the Kessler ground, all of it. Every parcel we looked at. You can't set a runway on ground that won't carry weight in April. The Mercer place was the only firm, well-drained approach on that stretch of the river. It was drained and tiled and graded. It was the only piece that would hold. The only piece. Yes, sir. Not ordinary bottom ground then, not the same as its neighbors. No, sir. Cahill's jaw was tight. It was the reason we chose that site at all. Without her drainage, there's no airfield there. We'd have had to build somewhere else, or spend a fortune making other ground do what hers already did. And then Gideon Marsh did the thing he had built the whole case toward. The one brick that held up all the others. He took the Corps of Engineers' own drainage map, the map from the report Voss had tried to bury, and he laid it flat on the rail in front of the jury. And beside it, open, he laid Daniel Mercer's green cloth ledger. And he asked Cahill to read the map's drainage lines, one at a time. The main tile run. The laterals. The grade of the lane. Then he asked Ruth's husband to answer, through the ledger in his own hand. Main tile, 1,100 feet, the fall of 1936. There it was on the map. There it was in the ledger, dated, priced, the laterals. On the map, in the ledger. The well, 40 feet down, on the survey, in the ledger. Line for line, the Army's secret map and the dead farmer's account book said the same thing. Daniel Mercer had spent 9 years building exactly the ground the United States Army decided it could not win the war without. A dead man's guesswork. The 2 documents matched like a key in a lock, and the whole room understood it at once, without anybody having to say it. Marsh let the silence do the last of it. Then he turned to the jury, and he did not raise his voice. He never once raised his voice. The Army wrote that this woman's 40 acres were essential, he said. Essential, their word, in their report. They needed it so badly they took it out from under a widow 3 weeks after they handed her a folded flag. I am not asking you to stop them. She never asked that. The runway can stand. My country needs it. He paused. I am only asking you to pay what essential is worth. That's all. You cannot call a thing necessary on Monday and worthless on Tuesday. Not to her, not to him. He touched the ledger, not to the man who built it and isn't here. He sat down. The jury was out a minute and a half. That's the truth of it. Not an hour, not a day. A minute and a half, and they filed back in, 12 farmers who knew to the dollar what drained bottomland with a live well was worth, because half of them owned some. The foreman was a big man with sunburn to his collar line. The judge asked if they'd reached a verdict on just compensation. "We have, Your Honor. Read it." The foreman looked at the paper, and then he didn't look at the paper, because he didn't need to. "We find the fair value of the land taken," he said, at $92 an acre. 150 acres. $13,800. He paused and added the part they'd insisted on. Plus interest from the day they took it. $13,800. More than 5 times the offer. More than 5 times $2,700. The number Voss had built his whole clean savings record on, the number the commission had rubber-stamped in 20 minutes in that very room, gaveling her down when she asked them to look, that number was gone. 12 of her neighbors had thrown it out and written the true one in its place. Ruth Mercer did not cry out. She did not weep. She sat with her hands folded, 37 years old, a widow over a hardware store, and she let out one long breath she felt like she'd been holding since the spring of 1943. That was all. One breath. The judge confirmed the award from the bench. He ordered the $2,700 sitting untouched in the court's registry released to Mrs. Mercer and made whole to the full amount, with the interest running from the June day the marshal had staked her field. Then he did one more thing, and he did it slowly because he wanted the record to carry it. He looked at the government's table. At Harlan Voss, the court notes for the record, he said, that the acquiring agent presented 3 comparable sales of dry pasture while recent sales of comparable drained bottomland existed in this county and were not disclosed to the commission. The court further notes that the same agent moved to withhold his own agency's survey, a survey that flatly contradicts the valuation he certified. He set his pen down. The district land office will want to review Mr. Voss's files, all of them. I'll be sending a copy of this record along to help them. Now watch each face. This is the part that matters. Not the number. The faces. Harlan Voss sat alone at his long table. His man had already begun packing the valise, the way people do when they want their hands to have something to do. Voss himself did not move. He looked straight ahead at nothing, and the smile that never reached his eyes was gone. Finally, all the way gone. And what was left underneath it was just a middle-aged man who had been caught in a room full of people who now knew exactly what he was. His savings record, that private ledger he was so proud of, it had just become the reason they were going to open every file he'd ever closed. He had never read Daniel Mercer's book. And that unread book had just cost him his whole career. Because if he had read it, if he had once, on that porch, taken it out of his folder and turned a single page, he would have known this day was coming. And closed the parcel honest, and none of this would be happening. Contempt is a kind of blindness. He'd been blind on purpose, and now everyone could see it. The 3 commissioners had come to watch. The ones who'd affirmed the 2,700, who'd told her she was pricing her well as if there were no water in it and then gavelled her down when she asked them to look. They sat together in the 3rd row, and they sat very still, and they did not look at each other. And they did not look at Ruth. Their 2,700 had just become 13,800 in open court, in front of every farmer whose land they might someday sit in judgment on. Nobody said a word to them. Nobody had to. The number said it. And Gideon Marsh, the broke veteran attorney with one leg, who had thought this case unwinnable until the night he opened the ledger. He reached across the table and he closed the green cloth book, gently, the way you'd close a Bible. He slid it back across to Ruth. "Your husband appraised his own land, ma'am," he said, quiet, just to her. "We just made them read it." She put her hand flat on the cover. She didn't pick it up yet. She just held her hand on it a moment, in that room. With the light coming down through the high windows the way it had the day they told her to sit down. Outside, when they came down the courthouse steps, the trucks were still there. The whole muddy line of them up and down Main Street. And the farmers didn't cheer because they weren't cheering people. They took their hats off. That's what they did. The Kessler brothers, and Ed Toohey in his good shirt, and a dozen more, standing by their trucks in the afternoon sun. They took their hats off as Ruth Mercer walked past with her husband's ledger under her arm. Because her verdict wasn't only hers. The government would have to pay the fair price for the next parcel now, and the one after that, all the way down the river bottom. She'd reset the number for every one of them. A widow over a hardware store had made the machine pay honest, and every man on that street knew his own land was worth a little more that afternoon than it had been that morning, because of what she'd refused to sign. There was one more thing, though, weeks later. And it's the smallest scene in the whole story, and it might be the one that matters most. The money couldn't be released to her without her signature on a form. A federal release. And the form, by the rules of that office, had to be brought to her and witnessed. And the man whose job it was to bring it, because it was still, on paper, his parcel, his file, until the review took it away from him, was Harlan Voss. So Harlan Voss came to the rented room above the hardware store. He climbed the outside stairs. He knocked on the door. It was the same as the notice, if you think about it. Different door, same act. Once he'd driven a tack into her doorframe with a paper that took everything. Now he stood at another door with a paper that gave it back, and he had his hat in his hands. Ruth let him in. She was calm. She had been calm through all of it, and she was calm now. On the mantel behind her sat the folded flag in its triangle case, and beside it, the green cloth ledger. Voss saw them both. He couldn't help but see them. He set the release form on the table. "You just need to sign," he said. "There, at the bottom. I'll witness it." And here is what Ruth Mercer did. She sat down. She pulled the paper toward her. And she read it. Every line. Slowly, the way Daniel used to read a seed contract, the way she'd read the condemnation notice twice on the day it went up on her door. She read all of it while Harlan Voss stood in her rented room and waited, hat in his hands, and had to watch her do the one thing he had never once done. Read the paper. Read every word before he moved. He'd pocketed her husband's ledger unopened. He'd filed her letter in a drawer unread. He'd built a whole career on not looking. And now he had to stand there and watch a war widow look, line by line, taking her time. In no hurry at all, until she was satisfied. When she was done, she signed it. She set down the pen and she slid the paper back across the table to him, the way Marsh had slid the ledger back to her. Voss picked it up. He hesitated at the door. Maybe he wanted to say something. An apology, or an excuse, or one last piece of that smile. Whatever it was, he didn't get to use it. "It's a fair price now," Ruth said. That was all. 4 words. She didn't say it cruel. She didn't say it warm. She said it the way you'd note the weather. And Harlan Voss put his hat on his head and went down the outside stairs, and that was the last time he ever stood in front of Ruth Mercer. 6 months later, it was a morning in the early part of the year, cold and clear. Ruth Mercer stood on a porch on the far side of Halverson County. It was a new place. Bottomland again, good bottomland, drained and watered, the kind she knew how to keep, bought honest, with the Honest Award, with money 12 neighbors had said out loud was fair. There was a lane running up to the road, freshly graded, cut by a neighbor's boy she'd paid to do it, and it shed the water clean the way Daniel would have wanted. She had a cup of coffee, and the steam came off it in the cold, and she stood and drank it and watched the light come up over her own ground. Behind her, through the screen door, on the mantel of the new front room, sat 2 things. The folded flag in its triangle case, and beside it, the green cloth ledger, closed, its work finally finished. Daniel had appraised his own land. He'd priced every foot of it, in his own hand, out of nothing but a hatred of owing anybody. and in the end his accounts had been read aloud to 12 strangers in a jury box, and the strangers had agreed with him to the dollar. There's a kind of man who lives on after he's gone, in the work of his hands, if somebody keeps the book. She'd kept the book. Off to the south, past the ridge, she could hear them, the training planes, taking off, one after another, climbing out over the river bottom from the airfield that stood now on her old ground, on the 40 firm acres Daniel had drained, the only acres for miles that would hold them. She listened to them go up. And she did not flinch. She never had. She'd never once wanted to stop those planes. The country needed them, and her husband had died for that country, in the Pacific, in the fall of 1942, and she would not have taken 1 hour of flight time from the men learning to fly them. Let them go up. Let them go all the way up. That runway was standing on the best work Daniel Mercer ever did, and there was a rightness in that she could live with. Standing on her own porch with her own coffee, on land nobody could tell her the worth of ever again. Word came, that spring, about Harlan Voss. Not much. Just that the review had run its course, and that he'd been moved to a desk somewhere far off. A desk where he prices nothing at all anymore. Where there's no land to lowball and no widow to bully. Where all day long he reads papers other men have already signed. That was all. Nobody in Ladonna lost sleep over where he'd landed. He'd become the kind of small the world stops noticing. Ruth finished her coffee. The thing she'd learned, and the thing she'd want you to carry out of this, is small and it is hard. Land can be taken and land can be paid for. If they take it, you can make them pay the true price. You can stand up, quiet, with the paper in your hand, and make 12 of your neighbors read the truth, and the law will hold the door open for you if you know to walk through it. The Fifth Amendment kept its word. The jury kept theirs. She got the fair price, every honest dollar of it, with interest from the day they staked her field. But a life given is not a thing you get a check for. There is no jury for that. No award, no interest, no registry that ever makes it whole. Daniel was gone, and $13,800 did not bring him up the graded lane at supper time. She knew that better than anyone alive. She had only ever been asking for the difference between what a man's work was worth and what they tried to pay for it. The rest of the loss she carried herself, and would all her days, and no court on earth had jurisdiction over it. She went inside. The screen door swung shut behind her, soft, and the planes kept climbing over the far ridge. And the ledger and the flag sat side by side on the mantel in the morning light. That's the whole of it. That's what a quiet woman did with a single sheet of paper and her dead husband's account book, in a small Kansas town, in the middle of a war. If you've watched this far, do me one small thing. Comment the town you're watching from. I'd like to see how far Ruth Mercer's story travels. Because there's a Ruth in nearly every county there ever was, and most of them never got their jury. This one did.